Thank you for having me. Thanks for coming out. So I thought I'd start by saying a few words about what this talk will be about. I was trying to be cute when I wrote the title, and I realized that it might have been at the expense of clarity. So hopefully once you hear what I'm actually going to talk about, you'll still stay. So the idea here is that technologies don't exist in a vacuum. They're embedded in social processes and social institutions. And so as much as we'd like to think that we can create tools and let them out in the wild and they'll have very specific effects, that's usually not what happens. And historical studies of technologies tell us this for lots of technologies from the past. So as a sociologist, I'm interested in the various social processes that influence and the various social factors that influence how technologies get used and how they diffuse. And then, in particular, as a sociologist, I'm also interested, like many other sociologists, in how resources might be differentially distributed among the population. So there's that aspect that also goes into my work. So I'll start by giving you a little bit of background on a few pointers, and then I'll show you all sorts of empirical data to back up my claims, mainly focusing on 3 studies that I've done. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the term the digital divide, very basically understood as this binary concept of people either have access to technology or not, and very much understood as this good or bad. So once you're online, it's great, you've crossed the divide. Well, basically my work, what I've argued is that that's a very simplistic approach, because even once people do go online, significant differences might remain as to how they actually use technologies and what they can get out of their uses. And so this is what I've called the second level digital divide in my work. And mostly I've focused on skill. So how will people's skills differ in using the medium? So next I'll give you the overall conceptual framework that informs my work. And then I'll talk a little bit about the challenges of data in this realm, and then I'll talk about the actual data that I have. Okay, so the idea is that we have users, right? Now users have certain backgrounds. They bring certain things with them. They exist in society. They take on certain positions. This means they have a certain socioeconomic background. They have other attributes, right? And all these then will affect not only how they use the medium, but also the context in which they use media. And so it's best to think of this context as 2 types. One is the technical context, and then the other is the social context. And the technical context is fairly obvious, right? What kind of quality machines do you have, connection, what kind of software do you have, et cetera. And then the social context is equally important, in that who you know, who's around you, what types of people you know, who can you learn from, who is advising you, who can you turn to when you run into a problem, who do you have to share your gadgets with. Those might all also influence how you're able to use the medium. Then the next step in this process is how all this relates to skill. So the idea is that all these factors that I've mentioned so far will influence users' skill. And so users will differ in their level of ability to make use of technologies. And the next, and this is probably the most relevant here, is I argue that all those factors, including skill, then influence what people actually do online. So it's not simply whether someone might have interest in something, or it's certainly not just random that someone will go to a certain website or sign up for something, but these various social factors actually influence the types of uses to which people put the medium. So I think that's where you guys probably have the most interest. Now as a sociologist, I have one more step in this process that's of really big interest to me. That's sort of the million-dollar question that's really hard to get an answer to and takes quite a while. And that is, does all this then feed back into people's actual position in society? So does your skill, and in particular the way you use the medium, then influence your position? Does it influence your socioeconomic status? Does it influence your general well-being? Are you getting something out of it that actually improves your life? And if yes, does that depend on all those other factors? Okay, so I thought I'd take a moment to say a few words about what I think of when I say internet skill, because that's not necessarily obvious. And I'm certainly open to people adding things to this list. So one is knowledge of etiquette and just simply how to use communication media when you're actually communicating with other people. Simple example would be use of BCC in certain situations. Then there's this idea of knowing how to contribute, so whether that's contributing to online conversations or actually posting material content online, knowing about various tools that help you create things or post things or share things. Then there's the idea of knowing what's even available online. Now, this is one of those factors that I would never have actually thought of until I started conducting interviews with people and talking to people about their uses, and realized that whereas I think all of us in this room, when we think of a question, we sort of assume, well, there must be an answer to it somewhere online. Maybe we won't be able to find it, but it must be out there somewhere. Whereas it's really fascinating to see that lots of people just don't even realize what's available. And if you don't even realize it's available, then you're never going to look for it. Let's say you do realize it's available, so then the question is, can you actually find it? And then how efficiently can you find it? So are you going to take 5 seconds or are you going to take 15 minutes? And then a few other factors. There's the issue of credibility and being able to assess whether source or message credibility. And then there are privacy and security concerns as well that are related to skills. So this is my list of skills. Most of my work so far has focused on those three of knowing what's available online, being able to find it, and being efficient in doing so. But I'm expanding my work to include all of the other factors. Okay, so to recap the questions that guide my work and that I'm going to answer to some extent today. So are there differences in skill among internet users? If yes, what explains these differences? How might skill differences influence what people actually do online? Does IT use vary by type of person? And then the question that I don't really necessarily have an answer to, but we can certainly start imagining what the answer will be, is how does all this influence people's life chances? Okay, so as I said, a word about data concerning people's internet uses when it's not about logs, right? So this is what I have in the title, which is Beyond Gigs of Log Data. And the idea is that while we can get all sorts of information from the logs of what users actually do, there's lots of information that's not in those logs. And that's usually the type of information that's actually of interest to me. I mean, logs are interesting too in and of themselves for sure, but I have interest in lots of things that just simply don't come through something like log data. And unfortunately, it's been pretty hard doing research in this realm as a social scientist because there really are not many data sets available, and certainly not rigorous data sets. So partly there's just little out there. What is out there is very basic. So if you're lucky to find a social science data set that actually has any internet questions, usually all it has is whether someone is an internet user, maybe how much they use the internet, almost never what they actually do online, and certainly very, very few nuances. Also, data sets are rarely comparable, so there's not one universal way of asking these things. They're fairly new, and so you might have a data set here, but they asked very differently about even very basic things, so you can't really merge the two data sets and compare. There's also this issue of lack of universal and established terms and ways of asking about things, so even something as simple or seemingly simple as how frequently are people online, that's in no way a simple question when it comes to survey research. And then finally, that everything online is a moving target, fairly obvious, but I mean, you know, let's say we're interested in studying use of social networking sites. Well, if you wanted to do that 3 years ago, first of all, users don't think of these as social networking sites, so that's not really a term you can use in a survey. If you mention an example, well, something might have been popular 3 years ago, today no one's using it. How is that then comparable over time? So those are some of the challenges. The most rigorous data set in some sense, and certainly for the US's general population, is the current population survey's computer use and internet supplement, which was administered by the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but they actually stopped doing that in 2003. So since then, we have no data. certainly from that large entity that collects extremely high-level data about people's internet uses. So people either collect their own data or have to rely on marketing surveys that don't, I mean, they're hard to get, but even if you get them, they usually don't have the kind of correlates that are really of interest to social scientists. So those are the challenges, and this basically explains why I've actually collected my own data for studying all the various questions that are of interest to me, because there are pretty much no surveys out there that ask about skill in a way that would be helpful for my needs. Okay, so as I said, I'll talk about 3 studies here and gradually answer the various questions that I've suggested are of interest. So one question, and this relates most closely to the user experience folks here, has to do with how average users find information on the web. And I did the first part of this research 5 years ago, and then followed up this past spring. This was done in New Jersey, in a county, Mercer County, which includes Trenton, in 0102. And then I went back to New Jersey this past spring and re-interviewed as many people as I could find from the sample. I'm not going to get into too much detail about the methodology here, but feel free to ask if if you really want to know something that you think would be important to understanding the findings. But basically what I did was I used the fairly traditional sampling methods for trying to get a random sample, bought a residential list, and then started sending letters and calling people to request their participation. Once they came into the university lab, I had them fill out a couple of surveys for baseline information, and then I also had them sit in a machine and look for various types of content. Now, the goal here was not for them to look for trivia information, little factoids. Rather, I wanted them to look for things that they might actually look for in their everyday lives and that might be relevant to their everyday lives. So those little things that were flashing on the screen are the types of information people were asked to look for. They had unlimited amounts of time to do this, and there were also no restrictions in terms of what platform they used. They could either use a PC or a Mac. They could use whatever browser they were used to using. So a third of the sample actually ended up using AOL because that's what they used. And there was no default homepage. So it was completely up to them to replicate as much as possible what they usually do. And so the outcome of this was being able to develop actual measures of people's skills understood as efficiency in finding information. And then from that, deriving survey instruments that actually work well as proxies for actual skill. Now, traditionally, there is definitely literature that looks at people's computer skills and internet skills, but these are what we can call self-perceived skills, meaning people are just asked what they think their skill is. Now, I have a paper that shows that, based on data from the same project, that there's a very strong gender effect with that question. So despite having equal levels of actual skill, women tend to underestimate their skills, or men overestimate. The point is that there's a statistically significant difference that's completely accounted for by gender only. So it's very tricky to rely on those self-perceived measures if we want to know about actual skills. So that's why it was important to develop some instruments that are better proxies than the traditional ones used. Okay, so a little bit of data about a little bit of what I found, some of the findings. So I'm reporting on 8 tasks that these people did, and this is a cumulative distribution function of how long they took. And this graph includes both people who gave up and people who were successful, but that's all randomly distributed, actually, along the graph. So you can see from here that some people were done with 8 tasks within 6 minutes, but others took over 45. And so this we can consider a basic measure of skill that, yes, there is actually divergence, right? Because some people are done very quickly while others take significantly longer. So then let's see what might predict skills. How can we explain different rates of success? The task that was hardest for this sample called for finding a third-party website that compared different presidential candidates' views on abortion. And so the study was right after the 2000 election, so the relevant thing was here was comparing Bush and Gore and their thoughts on abortion. There were several websites out there that addressed this question, but even given unlimited amounts of time, 43% of the sample couldn't do this at all. They just couldn't find such a website. So then I thought, okay, well, how can we explain the difference? Well, first, again, people took varying amounts of time, considerable difference in how long they spent on this task. And then what I did was using regression analysis, logit regression, just looking at the outcome of success versus failure with this task, and looking at the effects of all sorts of variables, right? Age, gender, time online, et cetera. What I found was what made a difference in successfully completing this task was whether a person used what I call a refined search query. I'll tell you what that is because I think people here think about that term differently. So basically, did the person type in a search query that included information both about the political side of this question and the fact that it was about abortion, right? So then I created a dummy variable where I put that in the model that if you typed in that kind of a refined query, then you got it 1, and it turns out that basically predicts whether you're able to do this or not. So if, not surprisingly, if you just type in abortion, you're not really going to find that type of a website, but a lot of people did that. Interestingly, before I put this variable in, age is what predicts completion, but then once you add this variable, the effect of age goes away, which suggests that older people are probably less likely to know this, how to refine their queries. But it's helpful because people tend to think that older people are less skillful online, but we don't really know why per se. A lot of the comments I get is that their motor skills are different, but motor skills don't really account for the kind of differences that we find in this kind of a study. So I thought I'd show you some of the hurdles that people run into. Now, these are things you can certainly know from logs as well, but I just thought they would be interesting. These are all actual examples from studies. So people will search without using spaces when asked why they do that. Oh, well, we don't use spaces in email addresses or web addresses either. This is the kind of thing that you don't know from the log, right? You know from the log that they did it. You don't know why they did it. Another common mistake is people writing in URLs with spaces in them, and browsers still don't deal with this too well. I think this is my favorite here. And it's just interesting that they have this concept that there's the .com somewhere at the end, but they don't really get what's going on. And so you could say here, okay, well, this was in 2001, 2002. Well, by time, they must have gotten better. And this was partly why I went back to re-interview the people, because I wanted to see whether they had. So in this last spring, I re-observed 44 of the people. And again, by definition, these are people who've been online for over 5 years, right? Because the initial users in my study, the initial people in my study were already users then. And so here are just a couple of examples of what people did this spring. Again, people who've been users for over 5 years. Here's an AOL user. Interestingly, even though a relevant response was actually here on the screen, she didn't find that, so she got sort of confused by the can't find website error. Then here's another example where the person is trying to guess things but runs into complete error. And again, this is for people who've been users for many, many years. Generally, I've found in the analyses of the data that how many years you've been a user doesn't really matter. It's how frequently you're actually online that matters. Okay, so spelling mistakes, again, this is something you could certainly know from logs. So why don't people notice them? Well, one reason is that they still get results, even if they have a mistake. Now, granted, the results are fewer, but they don't really realize that. The unfortunate part is that websites that have the spelling mistakes probably aren't the most reliable sources. So it's a problem for these people to be pursuing those responses. Now, also, is there anything more about spelling mistakes that could be relevant in any way? Well, for example, there are people who list items on eBay with spelling mistakes, right? Those items are going to be found by fewer people because they have those mistakes, which means if you listed something with a spelling error, you have less of a chance of selling it and certainly of having higher bids on it. So here we have lots of items that misspell this word. So if you make spelling errors or typos, that's going to be a problem. Now, if you're really on top of things, you know about this website that lets you not have to sit around guessing what mistakes people might have made. You can actually type in the correct spelling, and it'll tell you how people have misspelled things. So there's the one that we saw before, but it'll give you all sorts of other ways that equipment can be spelled, because look at all these many ways that it could possibly be spelled. So you could still say, okay, well, who cares? So people make spelling mistakes. Some people make them, some people don't. Well, it turns out that it's not randomly distributed who makes a spelling mistake and who doesn't. So if it's not randomly distributed, then some people are being disadvantaged by these mistakes more than others. And so from using data from this study, I was able to look at what actually predicts making a typo or a spelling mistake. And it turns out that so the higher your education, the less likely you are to make these mistakes. The more experience you have, the less likely you are to make mistakes. But again, the point is that it's not randomly distributed. So certain types of people are being disadvantaged by this more than others. Okay, so more generally speaking, findings from this study showed that by far the most salient finding is that younger people are better at finding things and are quicker, so more efficient. There's also a relationship of education to skill, and then experience and autonomy. And autonomy here meant having different locations where you can access the internet. So these findings suggest that there are potentially concerns about digital inequality, social inequality, because if people who are better educated are getting more out of it, then they might be reaping the benefits more than those who are in less privileged positions. I wanted to say a few words about the social support variable. It's very hard to get at quantitatively. So here I turn to some of the qualitative data from the study, some of the interviews, to show how much people's social surroundings do matter in how people are able to do things or find things or take advantage of the internet. And there are mainly two ways. One is if you just have people around you who know things, you hear things from them informally, they give you advice, you pick up on stuff. And then the other is if you run into a problem, you can turn to someone who can help you. My favorite is the one in the middle, where this woman knew about Google but didn't use it throughout the entire study. And then she says how if she needed it in the future, well, anyway, she'll just call up her son who's in another state at college to help her look stuff up and tell her what the results are. So that's pretty interesting, I thought. Then there are also limits that are imposed on someone due to the social context, and this has to do with having to share the media at home with others in your household, or having others to take care of who simply take up your time. So here's a stay-at-home mom with kids and doesn't really have time to use the internet, and this is an interesting case of the mother simply not being able to get to the machine because her daughter's always on it. So that limits her ability to really develop her own skills. Okay, so now on to a next study. So given that the most salient finding was age, I wanted to look at whether we could find skill differences in a nationally representative sample of young users. So what I did was I had some leftover funding, and so I did a survey, not a huge end. This is basically what $20,000 will buy you. The response rate's not as high as would be ideal, but again, it's a unique data set that has information on digital literacy and refined measures of types of uses, and both of those are pretty rare. So this is the skill measure survey measure of skill that I developed and used here. It's much less influenced by those gender factors that I talked about, so it works better than simply asking people about their skills. It seems that rating your level of understanding of certain items doesn't quite have the same relationship to simply how you perceive your skills otherwise, more generally speaking. These seem to work better. So basically, taking that as the outcome variable, what predicts higher level of understanding of those internet-related terms, which in the previous study seemed to be a good proxy of actual skill. What I found here was that education is positively related to skill yet again. However, once we control for autonomy of use and experience, the effect of education actually goes away. So this lets us see what's going on in terms of why is it that the more educated are better skilled, where really it's because they tend to have access at home and tend to have time to use the medium more. Then another measure I was interested in is diverse types of uses, understood as just what are the types of things you do online. It's a summary variable, summary measure of all sorts of things you do online, and the idea behind that is the more things you do, the more ways in which you might be able to benefit. That's one thought. And here, that's also positively related both to education and skills. So the higher your education, the better your skill, the more things you're doing online. So again, the idea is if you're already in a more privileged position, you are probably benefiting from the medium more than others. Okay, and now moving on to the third study that I wanted to talk about. Here the interest was, okay, let's look at a completely wired population. And so this is a study on college students, but it's a very diverse group of college students. So I'm not serving Northwestern, which is where I'm on the faculty, because that's not your average population. Instead, I'm doing this study at the University of Illinois Chicago, which has an extremely diverse student body. It's one of the most highly diverse in terms of ethnic diversity colleges in the US. There are a significant number of students who come from families where they're the first in college in their family. Also lots of immigrants, et cetera. So it's a very diverse sample, which is of interest. I administered this survey last year, so less than a year ago. And there's one required class on campus, and that's where we administered the survey. And the point here is that there's no selection bias as to who's taking that course, and then no selection bias as to who's taking the survey. So we're really getting a representative sample of the college campus, and we have a very high response rate in this case. This is the study that, thanks to a grant from MacArthur and now from NSF as well, we're continuing this year. So actually starting this coming Monday, we're going back to UIC and we're going to administer the survey again. And it should be really interesting to see how some of these things turn out over time. Okay, so to recap, what are the questions of interest in this case? Well, they're similar to the questions that we've been looking at so far. What is it that students do online? Are there skill differences among them? What social factors might influence their skills and types of uses? And then the final one is not one I will talk about today, but that's what this grant is for MacArthur. It's can we improve student skills? We're going to do a random assignment training intervention to see whether we can improve students' skills over time. Okay, so this is definitely the wired generation. There's no question about it. They've been online for many years. Lots of hours on the web per week. Those are only web hours, so they don't include hours spent on email and chat. They go online several times a day, several locations, not surprising. Okay, the majority have cell phones. Again, not surprising. What do they do with their cell phones? They do all sorts of things. Although interestingly, a fairly low number for now are going on the web and using cell phones for email. But again, it'll be interesting to see this year's cohort and how they compare. Okay, in terms of gadget ownership, again, they're very well equipped to be playing with media and using media. Most of them have either a desktop or a laptop computer. So the idea here, again, is to control for access as much as possible and look at a population that really does have access and is online often, and what can we tell about differences in their uses. Multitasking generation, they're doing lots of things while they're online. This is important to note for people who are looking at different media uses and thinking about how internet use might displace other media uses, because it might not be displacing other media uses given that they might just be multitasking. Okay, so I was interested first at looking at email use. There have been some reports, some people are starting to talk about how this generation doesn't use email that much anymore. And I was somewhat skeptical given that I am a college professor and I know that my students tend to use email. So I thought I'd test that here. It turns out on average, students use 2 email accounts. The majority of them do use their campus accounts. That would be of interest to administrators who try to communicate with them. And then otherwise, this is the breakdown of what emails accounts they use in terms of the other free services out there. So I thought you might be interested in, oh, okay, so 7%, I thought this was interesting that 7% only use their UIC email account. I found that surprising because you'd think in this day and age they would just open a free account somewhere, given that that's going to have limited utility over time. Okay, so I thought maybe you'd be curious to see if I can find anything out about, are Gmail users different in any way from the other users? And so I did find a few things. One is Gmail is, so you're more likely to be a Gmail user if you're a man versus a woman in this sample, a finding that is not true for any of the other services. So all of the other services are equally distributed by gender. And then I thought, what else could we look at? Well, it turns out that if you're a computer science major, you're much more likely to be a Gmail user than if you're someone else. And then I thought, doesn't this sort of sound like the people who work at Google? So anyway, again, none of that actually is true for any of the other email providers. So there's no field of study difference for any of the other ones. Now, one thing that might be going on here is that I also looked at, so I have a question on the survey about, do you use only one search engine or more? And about 45% of the students only use one search engine, and 85% of those use Google only. And then I looked, and those are so they tend to be men and computers, and so more likely to be computer science major. That's not the right way to put it. So if you're a computer science major, you're more likely to fall into that category. So maybe it's just that through knowing about Google, that's how information about Gmail spread. I'm not sure what it is, but I thought it was interesting to note that it's not random event that someone uses Gmail, it turns out. For now, it isn't anyway. Okay, so then I was interested in skill, as usual. There are various measures on the survey for skill. This time I'm not presenting the ones about rating your understanding of different terms, although the findings for those are the same as here. I had various questions scattered around the survey that can be understood as measures of skill. They're not necessarily asking whether you understand something. So for example, the first item, the question actually asked, do you use an aggregator or a feed reader? And the answer options were yes, no, I don't know what it means to use an aggregator or feed reader. So even in that context, which is actually would suggest a lower rate of people saying don't know, because they could have just said no, sort of ignore whether they actually know what it is. 41% said they don't know what it is. And again, think about how this is a fully wired, young, mostly 18-year-old college population. That figure about not knowing what an aggregator feed reader is, by the way, is consistent with the level of understanding of RSS, which was on that 1 to 5 scale, where 85% said they have absolutely no understanding of what RSS is. So I think it's a good reality check for those of us who live our lives, think about Web 2.0 and all these new things. And I'll have some more data on the reality check, by the way. But anyway, again, this is a young population. If anyone's going to be using these things, it's them. If anyone's going to know what these things are, it's them, and they don't. Only about a fifth actually knew what all of the above is, right? So the majority don't know at least part of this. So then I was interested, well, okay, so what predicts knowing this stuff and being more knowledgeable about various internet services and terms? And so the findings I report here are based just on bivariate stats, but several of the factors hold up even in multiple regression. So basically, these are the groups that are statistically significantly, that have a lower level of understanding of those items on the previous page at a statistically significant levels. So women understand those various items less than men. People who have parents with lower levels of education understand things less. People who don't have a computer understand things less. Again, there are these factors of different positions in society and how does that transfer to your knowledge. Then I was interested in what people do online. And so this is a list of activities. This was measured on, it was a spectrum of several times a day, daily, weekly, monthly, less than monthly, how often do you do it? And so this is aggregation of people who do these activities either daily or weekly. And they tend to be both for schoolwork purposes and entertainment. It's equally there. I think some of the things probably, again, it's hard to measure. So for example, very few say that they visit dating or matchmaking sites. I suspect what's going on is that they're doing those kinds of things on, say, social networking sites, and they don't think of those as dating and matchmaking sites. So that's just another example of how it is hard to study and measure some of these things, depending on the population you're studying. So again, I was interested in whether users' background relates in any way to these activities. And so again, I created a summary statistic. And of course, one could disaggregate and look at specific activities, et cetera. But again, similarly, a lot of those groups that highlighted before, they tend to do fewer of those activities on the previous page regularly. And the variable of interest skill is also related to activities again. So if you know less, you're doing less. So finally, I just thought I'd put up this this slide because it's interesting and I think sometimes surprising. I mean, it depends on how much you're in touch with reality, frankly. But so these are data, again, from about 11 months ago, and I'm sure some of these figures will have changed, and some of them, I'm sure, have not changed. And I will be very curious to see what figures we find this year when we redo the survey starting next week. But so this is figures for people who use it sometimes or often. So I anticipate seeing changes in the numbers for YouTube, possibly for Facebook, not much else. Okay, so just briefly, what's the puzzle in all of this for Google in particular? Well, undoubtedly, Google has some wonderful products that I'd be the first to admit. Some of them are awesome. Of all those many products it has released, there are basically two that have gotten significant market share, right? We've looked at the Gmail numbers, not really sure you can say that. Some of these are fairly recent entrants and things might change, but so far there isn't necessarily evidence of that. Based on even the little data we've looked at so far, it's not surprising some of this might be happening. We know that women tend to be more likely to, I think there are data that show that they're more likely to use chat and the communication types of media, but if they're less likely to be Gmail users, then it's not surprising that they might be less likely to, that say Google Talk isn't taking off that much, for example. So, so I think there is that puzzle, and seeing what types of people adopt what types of products could be interesting, and one needs to go beyond one's user base to figure that out. Okay, so a few concluding remarks. Hopefully I've showed you convincingly that people's background does actually influence their types of uses and their skills, and skills influence types of uses as well, and all this might result in differential opportunities. And then finally, understanding a tool's diffusion has to be based on more than looking at the existing users of those tools, and understanding what social context, what is the social context in which people use the internet to understand better why they're doing some things and why they're not doing some other things. So that's it. Copies of my papers, media coverage, et cetera, is on my website. Thank you.
So remind people before they ask you questions that this is going out on our external video, so no complicated questions.
So given the fact that there are so many differences with regards to people's skill, do you have any hypotheses on what techniques might be most effective in increasing skill levels?
Okay, so the question is, given that skills matter, what are the techniques that might help people improve their skills? I'm repeating the question so others will know. Yes, well, that's a very good question, and that is something I'm working on for this training intervention, right? So the idea is come up with training that where we can try to improve people's skills. Well, I think some of the findings suggest that even very basic things make a difference. So again, this is something I think you could know from logs, that even this basic idea of having refined queries, a lot of people don't understand. I think also explaining certain tools that I don't think get explained very clearly would help. It's not clear what would be the best method to do so, right? So obviously every website, or most websites have a help page, about page. Clearly users don't look at those. I think more user studies are necessary. I think there are a lot of things you can't figure out until you do user studies with the average user and not with your friends. For example, I've been pre-testing, so we're going to do observations on the students after we survey them this year. And I've been pre-testing some of the tasks that we want to give them, and one of them involves looking up the location of something. And the people who ended up going on Google Maps, it was really fascinating to recognize some of the limitations in Google Maps in terms of usability that you only see when you test with average users. But also, things like RSS, I mean, I'm not convinced it would necessarily be that helpful actually to everybody, which is why I suspect it hasn't taken off. But I don't think they're explained in a way that's relevant to people's lives. They tend to be explained in how they're relevant to a techie's life or journalist's lives, because those are the people who write about this stuff. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's a silver bullet solution per se. I think it's a myriad of things. Part of it does require some time investment on the user's behalf, right? And that's tricky. Lily.
So I have two questions, but you can like pick one if you want or defer to someone else. So my first question was, I was wondering whether like the number and like quality of ties people have predicts their skill. Just because I'm thinking about when I was in high school and I had friends who would play like networked computer games, but they're all guys, and they'd be like, no, it's a guy thing. It's like I basically didn't have access to that network, and like they were teaching each other a lot of stuff. So I wonder if your study, has looked at any of that or seen any hints of that. And then the other
Can I take that first? I'll take that first. So the question is whether people's quality and types of ties or size of networks or something. Basically, whether qualities of one's networks predict people's skills or what they can learn. The hypothesis is definitely that yes, they do, and this is what I was referring to as being extremely difficult to measure. Now, there's a whole other method out there, social network analysis, that one can use to study these sorts of questions. It's a pretty elaborate method that's pretty expensive to latch onto other existing survey methods if you already have a big study. So that's one challenge there. I think if you had a focus study that really just was only looking at social ties, you could try to get some of this. It's still hard. Certainly on surveys, it's extremely difficult. I've been working on this for years. Initially, I asked people the number of types of people they could turn to for advice, and that didn't seem to work as a variable. Then I proceeded to asking people whether there was an especially knowledgeable person in their network and who was that person, and that doesn't seem to tell us much. So, so far I haven't really made the kind of progress on this as I would like. It's a difficult question, but I think you're definitely right that you're referring to people hang out with people who are like them and like to communicate with people who are like them. And here, if you have a woman in a group of men, that it would be difficult for that woman possibly to get information. So you had another question?
Okay, the other one was just, you had the question of does the access improve life chances? Like, are there any findings about that, or do you have any findings?
Right, so the question is, do I have any findings about this issue of whether access or types of uses improve people's life chances? So that's a really difficult question that requires really rigorous investigation, requires longitudinal work, right? Because you need to control for a whole bunch of things. You need to have baseline measures of where people are at and then see where they will be at a second point in time, and how does all this work in. So that's a very complex study. I'm working towards that with my current study. I mean, my hunch is that yes, definitely, based on the findings we have so far, which is that we're certainly finding positive relationship of education and some of these other things to how you're using the medium. But I think this is something we have to continue to work on. Saw some other hands. Okay.
I also have two questions. One is, from the surveys you've done, do you perceive there to be kind of a continuum in skills such that someone trying to develop a tool, they have the log data, and so they can kind of see how their users, fail to do things. So, so you get kind of a marginal user, like the person who actually tried something and didn't succeed. So, like, you think that it would be possible to sort of extend usability down from the person who almost gets it, or is there a sort of broader step, so like you can't kind of do a refined search, right? You either do it or you don't.
Okay, so the question is whether I find there to be a spectrum of skills. Is that correct? So the sort of
So is it like
continuum that's fairly equally distributed,
or sort of discrete jumps?
or whether they're discrete jumps.
This company?
I think looking at the data, so for example, at least the skill measures of the level of understanding types of items, of which I have over 30 on this survey, so it's even more refined, it's a normal distribution. So, I mean, it seems like it's pretty much spread out. It's not like you have a few people who know nothing and then, or half don't know anything and the half know everything. No, it seems to be pretty much a continuum.
And then also, you said that it's hard to gather the sort of rigorous social science data sets. I know that in some other fields there are existing data sets that are being kept secret. Like there's the marine biologists, like the Navy, and so here there were things like AOL leaked a whole bunch of the search queries.
They didn't leak them. They actually handed them over to a researcher. Yes.
All right. Well, so like the search queries that were in theory supposed to be private, and like so all the search companies have a big database of all the queries. But if you went and asked, hey, can I see like 10 gigs of your logs? They would presumably say no.
Especially after the AOL case.
Right. So do you feel that getting access to that data would be a meaningful help? Was the AOL data much more useful than the surveys that you do of like UIC students?
Okay, so the question is whether getting access to some of the proprietary data that exist would be helpful for research. For example, Jake mentioned the AOL log data that were released to some researchers that were then released completely publicly, which then had repercussions, lots of privacy concerns, et cetera. And so whether if I had access to logs like that, which I do, I mean, I could get those AOL data, and I did, would that be more helpful than data that I have through my surveys? Now, the answer, so this goes back to the title of the talk, which is Beyond Gigs of Log Data, which is that there are definitely limitations to log data. So some things it's really helpful for, which people at this company and others certainly know. And in that sense, it's very painful for me to collect even data from 100 people and their little logs that I then go on coding, when I know that within a minute you collect about 100,000 times as much. I mean, that's pretty painful. That said, as I said, those log data lack all sorts of covariates that don't exist in log data that I would have in studies of this sort that then I'm able to look at in conjunction with looking at the logs. So I guess the answer is for certain research questions, having those log data are extremely helpful. So for example, I wouldn't have to guess, well, how many people make typos or how many people use refined queries, because you have the data right there. So that would be helpful, and it would be really lovely for me to see more publications off of those data, because then I could cite them and refer to them. But otherwise, I think there is definitely a need for these types of data. Another reason is that log data are always, by definition, well, unless you got it from, say, an ISP as opposed to a company like this, but if it's from a company, then by definition, those are only log data of that particular company's services. And again, that's going to have limited utility if you want to generalize to the average internet user. There was a question back there.
It seems like you spent a lot of time developing your questionnaire about skills and validating that and so on. And I've seen some questions in them that are more like factual questions. Do you know the answer to this or not know the answer? Such as names and ways in which you can tell whether a web page is secure or not. And using that as a way to judge people's skill levels. And I was wondering if you tried those sorts of questions and rejected them, or what sort of roads did they go down there to form those questions?
Okay, so the question is that there are other ways of measuring skills. For example, you can present people with scenarios where you ask them, what was the example? It was,
Can you tell whether a web page is
okay, so for example, how can you tell if a web page is secure? Do you know if these were open-ended or if they were multiple choice?
the ones I've seen were
Okay, so and I would say the open-ended ones have more utility. Once it's multiple choice, it's easier for I mean, for one thing, just by random, just randomly you would have a certain percent who would get it right. The problem with open-ended questions is that they're obviously extremely expensive to code and deal with and incorporate into the data set. So we try to limit open-ended questions because they're so expensive. It's a good idea. We're definitely still working on asking about skill in different ways. We have a few new questions that's going in the field next week. If open-ended wasn't as expensive, I would love to use it more, but it's almost prohibitive.
Just a follow-up is, can we get access to the questionnaires that you've used?
Question is, can you have access to the questionnaires I've used? You can certainly email me, and I'm happy to share material. There's also, some of it has been published, and the items are on there. You had a question?
Have you thought of asking your respondents permission to access their social networking data to get network correlates for skill or the things that you're asking in your question?
The question is, have I asked my respondents to access their social networking data to get at some of the questions? My question for you is, what do you mean by their social networking data?
There are, Facebook, for example, has excellent penetration into universities.
So you're asking specifically their logs or information, account information about specific services they actually use. That's what you're asking about?
The permission to ask Facebook for their friends.
Oh, I see. So the permission to ask Facebook
Yeah.
for their friends' networks. And I'm sorry, what did you say?
I was asking whether what he meant was specifically whether he was asking for the graph of the friends network.
Okay, so specifically, for example, the graph of the friends networks. Okay, well, I haven't thought of that. I can think of a few issues with that. I mean, it's an interesting idea. It's not clear. It would certainly tell us a few things. But again, it limits usage to one site. I suspect few would say yes, but you could always try. I mean, it's worth trying. It's always worth trying. Again, what would you get out of it? You could certainly get a network map. You would, I mean, is the idea you would also get, okay, the problem is that's still just one site and one activity. And so you have to assume, well, even if you get access to all the messages they exchange on there, what percentage of their general message exchange happens on that one site?
I was purely considering the friends network.
Okay, so just the network map. Could be interesting. Again, it's less than 80% use it. It might be higher this year. Even if they do use it, it's not clear to what extent. So it's not really clear what it's really telling us. What we're trying to do this time around, what we didn't do last year, is ask more questions on the survey about social network site usage. Where we will ask more, and actually, more generally speaking, we don't have that much information in the last survey about communication. So how often are you text messaging friends? How often are you calling them, et cetera? But similarly, as my answer to Lilith's question, it's a whole other undertaking to try to be mapping. And I realize your idea is to sidestep the cost of collecting those data by getting this in an automated manner. I think the problem is that even among college students, even with Facebook, you're not necessarily getting their full network. And especially with a population like UIC, half of them don't live on campus, so that it's not quite the kind of college campus that is the case in some other schools. And so I think the networks are actually much more complicated that might not be reflected on their Facebook accounts.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up.
Okay, well, thank you.